Hello everyone, thank you for joining to this live session. I'm Rad from RADACAD, very glad to be here with you today and answering all of your Power BI questions. If you haven't been attending the previous one, the situation, the way to ask the questions is that you either scan the barcode beside me, the other way, this way, the barcode beside me, and type in your questions there, or you go to that web URL pigeonhole at and using that passcode ask your questions there. But in addition to asking your question, also try to vote for other questions as well, because that helps me to understand what is a question that most of you might have, and then we'll go through that. So in this, let's say 30 minutes or more or less, we'll answer some of the questions. And usually when you ask your questions in advance before the session starts, I have time to prepare something and demo it to you. Otherwise, I might still answer it, but it might not be with a live demo. Okay, right, so let's go into the question panel. So here is where your questions coming, and I'll take from those which have most votes. So question from Letitia, how can I count missing null blank rows from a join table? This is in the visualization panel. I have tried count blank and other functions in DAX, but doesn't seem to work for a left outer join table. So Letitia, I would say this is not a very detailed question, but I would answer it as much as I understand the question. So you are trying to combine a couple of tables. I believe you are doing that in DAX using join functions in DAX, which is fine. Perhaps you are creating like a measure with virtual tables, and then the result of that presented somehow in a visual. I guess this is the situation. This might be a little bit different. This might be a calculated table joining a few other tables, and then you want to see how many null blank values you have based on left outer join. So in DAX, you can definitely do that using join functions. If the count blank doesn't work, I would try to debug it and see what is the situation. I would create different steps with different variables, getting the count rows result of each variable, seeing if the process is happening really, showing that in a visualization. That is the way that if you want to run a measure, you would debug it in DAX, or you can use tools such as DAX Studio to debug it. So count blank, if it doesn't work, why it doesn't work? I would try with that first and find out why this is happening. But I would also suggest you to take a step back and see why you are doing that in DAX. I mean, if it is a measure, if it has to be dynamic, perhaps it is fine. But if it is not going to be a dynamic calculation, something like this, joining a couple of tables together, left outer join, I would say this is more like a Power Query thing to do or data transformation thing to do than DAX. And I can show you how something like that can be done in a Power Query. Let me just switch into my other screen. So here you can see that I have a Power BI desktop. Now, as I said, this might not be exactly valid for your situation, because you might want to have a dynamic calculation, but in most of the cases, data transformation is a good option to do in Power Query. Let's say I have a data source. I have a couple of tables here. I'm just selecting a couple of tables. Let's say product subcategory. And then if I have these two tables and I want to apply join between them in Power Query, I can easily do that. In DAX, you can also do it using join functions, but in Power Query, this process is fairly simple. You select one table and then merge queries. Merge queries as new, I would say. I would keep those queries intact, and then I can say, well, merge it with product subcategory based on the joining fields, product subcategory key here and product subcategory key there. This allows me also to choose the join type or join kind. In your case, you might want to use left outer join, but what you are trying to do is to do left outer join and find blank values. So meaning that you want to find those rows that exist in one of the tables but not the other tables. So here we have other options as well, which might be even better. Something like this is actually giving you how many rows that are in the first but not in the second. So instead of left outer join, you might use this, right? But I just use left outer join for now. I'll just do this left join. This new table would come as something like this. Now what I can do is I can do a lot of different things. I can first expand this table to at least one of these columns. I'll just select one of these columns, let's say the key column in here. Now if this key column is null, then these are count of blank rows for me, right? So I can then just get the count of blank rows here, and that would be correct value for me, which I can do that with a conditional column, saying that, well, if this column, the column that we have just created, equals null, show 1, otherwise 0, and I would say this is if null. Now you can make it even easier with just one single step with changing in the script, but I want to show it with the UI here to you. So then here I can simply just go to transform tab and say, well, I want sum of this column. So this would be the count of blank rows. But this is just one of the ways. If I change the merge to something like left anti, that or right anti, depends on which table you want to see the values coming from, that might give you the right answer right away. After that, you just get count rows of that. As I said, this is only one of the ways. This is the Power Query way of doing it. In DAX you can also do that, but first you need to always think about, do you want to do it in DAX or do you want to do it in Power Query? I have written one article earlier this week about top 5 mistakes that you might have in Power BI. One of them is to really understand where you want to do that calculation. Okay, I hope that answered your question. Let's go into other questions. That's good, getting some of your questions coming in. Next question, when loading a fact table from a SQL table from which we need to extract some columns in separate table, what would be the most performant way of doing it? Okay, let me understand this a little bit better. So you are loading a table from SQL table and you want some of the columns of that in a separate table. What is the best way to do it? Well, you can do it in multiple ways. One way is that you can create a view, stored procedure, something like that in SQL or whatever database source you have, which has those specific columns and exactly the way you want it, and just load it into Power BI. And if you want to have like an extract of that as a separate but with fewer columns, create another stored procedure, another view for that. That is one way of doing it if you are more familiar with coding in SQL, stored procedures, views, and things like that. If you are much more familiar with Power Query, you can do something like this in Power Query. You can get data from that table in Power Query. Let's say you have one query with all of these columns, another query with just the selected set of those columns. Power Query automatically applies query folding, depends on the data source, depends on the transformation. But if you don't have any specific transformations, in this case you are just selecting some of the columns, this would definitely fold, and this would be also performing really fine. So it really depends on where you are more comfortable to do the transformation, and then you can apply it in there. The next question. Okay, now we have, before jumping into this question, we have a bunch of those questions with one vote. I'll go to the one that came a little bit earlier because that was the very first question I get, and I have an example to show you on that as well. So the question here was that, well, we want to build a star schema. The best way to build a star schema when we have different granularity of dimension tables. Now, a star schema is a way of designing a data model. Of course, when you build the data, when you build a data model, you don't bring data exactly as is. You'll change it. You'll create fact tables, dimension tables, single directional towards fact table, one-to-many directional towards fact table, and they will filter the fact table. Now the question here from Padu is that, well, what if I have different granularity, let's say two different fact tables with two different granularity and something like that? So that is a good question, and I have written a couple of articles, explained it in a couple of videos before. I'm going to just show it to you in one of these demos. Let me first show you where you can find these articles. So I have a couple of articles. One is budget versus actual zero complexity model. This is back in 2019, so like almost 3 years old now. This is a situation that we have two different fact tables. One of them is budget, which has quarterly data. The other one is sales, which has daily data. Now, if you want to have quarterly data and daily data connected to the same date table, how does it work? Because date table only has like one record per day, not one record per quarter. If you connect date table to your facts budget, then it would create a many-to-many relationship, both directional, which is not ideal. It has some performance issues. So what should we do? What I explained through this article, okay, sorry, I just remembered that I didn't share my screen that has this article. So what I explained through this article, budget versus actual zero complexity model, is that you'll bring one of your fact tables in a level that can connect to the granularity of your date dimension. It doesn't mean that in budget data you like split the budget data into daily. That can happen as well, but you don't need to do that. You can just add a day version of every quarter, like the first date of the quarter, the last date of the quarter, add that into your budget table, and then connect that to the date table. That is a valid connection. That is a one-to-many relationship from dimension to the fact table. It would be still a valid star schema. Let me show you that model in this example that I have. Trying to get to that example. Yep, here it is. So I'll bring that over here. So I have a fact table, which is fact reseller sales. This sales table has granularity of daily sales. It is connected to employee, it is connected to product, and it is connected to the date, but it is a daily information, and this is the connection. But I have the sales quota table. Imagine this is budget table or something like that. This is also connected to employee, but it is connected to the date table, not because this data is daily. I have created this date key for situations that like the data is not really on a daily data. I'll show you what the fact sales quota data looks like. So here it is. This is a quarterly data. So it is actually for example, the quarter that starts in October. And what I've done, I considered 1st of October as a date, or quarter that starts in July, I considered 1st of July as that. And then I created the relationship. That makes it really easy, fully a star schema, everything works fine. Even if your visualization, if you want to visualize something, as long as you have quarterly visualization, you have the sales data, you have the budget, you have budget versus actual percentage, all of that calculation works. The only situation that this might not work by default is that if you want to go below the granularity level that your table supports, for example, the budget data or quota data supports only quarterly data. But what if I want to go to the monthly? Would that work for monthly? Because if you go to the monthly, other month, like the first month of each quarter has data, but other month doesn't. Then you can combine it with some DAX expressions. And I have, again, written another article with the DAX expressions. So this is a 2 articles series. Another article with the DAX expression, that how you can resolve this with some formulas. There are tons of different formula types you can use in here, but that formula practically just split that budget based on the number of days we have in that quarter, which means that even if you go to the day level, you would be able to still compare those values. In some in some requirements, going to the day level when the budget data is in quarter level doesn't really make sense, so people won't go into that scenario. But if you want to do that, that is also possible. So that was, let's say, long answer to this question, but back to the question. So if you have different granularity of different of same dimension into different fact tables, yes, you can just bring that into granularity of one of these, not by adding rows, although that is also another approach. I would say by just connecting it to one of the granularity levels, like a subcategory, something like that, that would work, and then get the rest of that done, and this would be a fully established schema perfectly fine. Okay, marking that as answered. Great. So back to here, question from Anand. Best way to handle multiple fact tables when common tables, dim tables. That was actually, like the previous one that I showed you, was exactly a demo of something like that. I'll just bring that diagram one more time so that you can see it. So in here, as you can see, I have two different fact tables here. One is fact reseller sales and one is fact sales quota. This is a fully star schema. One of the misconceptions we have in a star schema design is that people think it is just like one fact table in the middle, all dimensions around. Well, it is that, but it can be multiple fact tables. Like here you can see this fact table is connected to these two dimensions, one too many from each. So it's like a star, but with 2 points only. This is also a fact table with 3 dimensions, actually 4 dimensions. Date is also here, 4 dimensions. So this is also a star schema, star with 4 points. And these dimensions, as long as they are shared dimension, they would filter both tables. If it is just one single dimension, it would filter one of the dimensions. That is an example of how something like that would work. Great, so going to the next questions, again starting from those that came a little bit earlier. Okay, why my sales forecast is not showing up the end of the year? It shows only up to this month. I have data up to the end of the year. Well, without looking at your report, without looking at your visualization, your model, it is really hard to say. But I would say first look at if there is anything filtered in your report, like you may have it filtered to show things up until today, or another thing is that you may not have used the custom date table. I would always advise to have a custom date table, especially if you have data more than, let's say, today's data. Have a custom date table. I have a script for that. There are scripts for in other websites by other MVPs and other community leaders as well. Create a date dimension with that, connect it to your table. Then when you show it, it represent whatever data you have. If you just rely on the like a default date table, this might be happening because of that, I would say. And if you have formula, have a look also to see why your formula is not supporting something like that. You may need to look at your calculation. Question from Ramon. I have 2 fact tables, one header, one with the lines, and I merged them to get a star schema. The header fields are repeated as many times as they are in the lines. How I can make calculation with the numeric fields? I think that is like exactly what I mentioned. Go and check those articles that I talked about in budget versus actual. That is an exact scenario of something like this, and you'll see how you can build the model, how you can write the calculation. So I'll go to the next question from Ag. Can you explain why cross-directional, or both directional, I think you mean here, when relation, you mean why we have cross-directional when relationship is 1-to-1? Well, 1-to-1 relationship is not happening like that often. It happens only in certain situations. Let's say if you have the same granularity in 2 different tables, you will have 1-to-1 relationship. Example, let's say I have a table with customers. So each record belongs to one customer. Let's say I have a customer ID or customer key that is for every single record, and I have unique rows per customer. So I have, like, let's say 20,000 customers. This table has 20,000 records. Now I have another table which is, let's say, customers' phone number, and this is their most up-to-date phone number. This is not their history of phone number, like if they had a phone number 10 years ago but now they have a different phone number. This table doesn't have that history. Just I'm building a situation, I'm building a scenario here, right? Let's say this is their most up-to-date phone number, and imagine everyone has a phone number in that table, right? So this table would be also 20,000 records because every customer has a phone number, right? Or it might be their address or anything like that, right? These two tables are two separate tables with the same granularity. 20,000 records here, 20,000 records there, customer ID unique value here, customer ID unique value over there as well. This creates a situation of one-to-one relationship. When it is a one-to-one relationship, actually this table can filter that table can filter this table. This doesn't impact the performance of your model. It is just like these two considered as one table, let's say, right? And that is also one of the reasons why we normally merge these two, like one-to-one kind of relationship tables together in Power Query, in data modeling. Like if I have a situation like this, I would, in ETL, in Power Query, I would combine them together. I would build one customer dimension table with these, like all of these customer columns plus this phone number as well. All of that in one table, because there's no point of having that as a two separate table. I'm not saying that if you have two separate tables, it would impact the performance or anything like that. It is just the fact that, like, you end up with more tables than what you need. So one-to-one relationship by default is both directional because it doesn't affect the performance. It is just each table can talk to the other table. They act like one single table. My recommendation would be combining them really to have one table instead of two tables, because they are just practically the same thing if the granularity is the same. Right, next question. How do I believe my incremental refresh is working? I don't see any logs to find it. Picked delta records only. From Ready. Well, that's a good question. Power Query gives you the ability to do incremental refresh. Data flow, Power Query, Power BI dataset, all of these gives you the ability to do data refresh. But this is really a challenge, I would say. At this stage, as of now, we don't have a way to monitor, let's say, I don't know, like how many records last night in the last refresh populated in this table, how many records been failed, how many records been like under some specific circumstances, what is the latest refresh date and things like that. Now, some of these you can find it using some workarounds in Power BI, in Power Query, like what is the latest refresh date. You'll go and pick the latest date of that table with the date field that it might have. Things such as how many error rows you might have. You can get the latest error count by some methods I explained in some other videos, which is like about how to do error handling in Power Query, but that is the most up-to-date records. If you want to really have the history of this, I would say consider doing part of this ETL in another way as well. Like, for example, create a stored procedure, or use SSIS, Azure Data Factory, some other tools and services in addition to Power BI, so that they can give you the ability to monitor. For example, in SSIS, you can actually, like, you have a pipeline of data coming here, going there, and then you can pass part of that data into a different table, and you can record that. For example, well, last night in the last refresh, I had 105 records populated in this incremental refresh, something like that. Now, that is SSIS. Data Factory does something similar to that in another way. If you use stored procedures and something like that, you can write into tables. Now in Power BI world, there are few things coming in the pipeline. I don't know when they would be available, but they would help in monitoring these in the future. And not that they are built for monitoring purposes, but they would give you the ability to do something like this in the long term. So things like that would be easier in Power BI a little bit later. For now, I would say get some help from other ETL tools as well. Okay, right. Question from Reddy again. When I join table, I'm losing hierarchical structure in one table. It shows like flat structure. Example, join table 1, table 2. I lose data structure in one of the tables. I guess the reason is that one of your tables is in a different granularity of the other table, and this question I would say is like very general. I don't really know the details of that, so that I give you more context around it. If you really have these two tables at two different granularity, and if you want to like have that hierarchical design of what you want, why are you joining these two tables? I would say at the first instance, building a star schema of course is important, but you also need to understand how these tables work together. When you flatten the structure, you need to know that your columns from other tables coming into this table. Again, I'm answering very generic here. This is not a very detailed question, so that I give you a detailed response. Okay, now because we don't have much time, let me just have a look at few of these and see if any of these I can answer fairly quickly, and it might be something related to most of you. Like, can I expect videos about the NEP visual on your YouTube channel? Definitely. We'll get Daniel hopefully himself to present something like that. Thank you for mentioning that. Question from Anonymous. My data has sales amount and also has month year concatenation as month ID. How I handle it? How to convert it to a date format? So you have month year concatenated. How you want to get date format from it? That's possible using Power Query. Let me share my screen again, and if I go to any of these that I have, yeah, perhaps better to go into like my other Power Query file. So let's go here. Let's say I have a data table like this, just showing you a very simple sample live. Let's say your data is like this, 2022, and you have month as well, like month 1, 2022, month 2, 2022, month 3. So you have a data like this. Let's assume this is your data set. Now, if you want to achieve, like get the month out of it, there are like some simple way of doing it. One way is that you can first split it so that you have year and month separated. For that, I would first convert it to a text as a new step, let's say. And then there are certain transformations here. For example, I can add column, and I can say that column is extract of the first characters, because the first 4 characters are year. So the first 4 characters, I get that. I would say this is year. Then from this, I would get extract of the last 2 characters. I would say this is month. Now you have the year, you have the month, you just need to have the day, so that then you can build your date value. Now, because in this case you don't really have a day, we have to assume there is a day. So this can be like the first day of the month, the last day of the month, the first day, perhaps making it easier. So I add a custom column. I would say this is day, and the value is 1, right? So first day of the month. Then I can select all of these together. I would say, well, add column, merge these columns, put a hyphen between these. Merge column is like concatenating them together. Then it creates something like this. Now I can convert it to date, right? And it gives me the date. But remember that this is like the first day of every month. So this is one way of doing it. There are, again, other ways of doing that, but I just showed you one sample. Okay, let's take one last question. So we talked about dimension table used in multiple fact tables. I marked that as answered. We have two questions. I think that is also similar. Best way to share. Okay, I think this is a more common question. Let's go to that. So question from Anand: best way to share common date or customer table across workspaces. So first thing is that if you want to share a table across multiple files, because for example, the date table, the customer table, product table, you might have multiple PBIX files, multiple data analysis solutions that are using the same thing. So the best way to share that first is that don't have it inside your Power BI file as the whole transformed table. Like for example, if you created that date table inside Power Query of Power BI Desktop, try moving it into data flow, right? When you move it in data flow, other files can also use it. Now, in some implementation, we see people are not using data flow. They are using Azure SQL Data Warehouse, Azure SQL Database, Synapse, Snowflake, any like on-premises data warehouse database, doesn't matter, any of those. Have it in that source, because that way other files can use it. In terms of data flow, if you use data flow, if you have it in a data flow and use it in other reports, then it is good that that data flow be inside a workspace, and that workspace is shared with the report developers of all other reports. Like for example, I can create a workspace with, let's say, generic dimension tables or something like that. This has the data flow that has date dimension in it, customer dimension, depends on the sensitivity of data and who won't have access to what. And then from there, you can actually have report developers ability to get data from this data flow and then building data from it. They need to have access to that workspace so that they have access to that data flow. I have explained this in 2-3 different articles. If you go and check RADACAD website for workspace structure or how to have a shared table created using data flow, you'll see what I mean. Okay, thank you for all of those questions. For the rest of the questions, we'll be able to go through those questions. We'll be able to go through those questions in the next week. Hopefully, we'll have another live session next week. Thank you all for joining this session. If you have any other questions in Power BI, reach out. We'll have another live Q&A next week, or just send us an email, contact us through our website. We have also some articles and videos. Recently published a video about, Leila published a video about how to concatenate multiple values in Power Query, using Power Query in Power BI from a list. I published a video and article about the top 5 mistakes that we see at the beginning of using Power BI. A lot of people make, a lot of Power BI developers make, so make sure you avoid those. Have a look at our blog, and if you have any questions, again, reach out. Thank you again for joining this live session. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.